The air in Sector 9 tasted of ozone and ancient rusted iron. Silence hung heavy, thick enough to muffle the sound of a heartbeat. Then, the floor shuddered. A deep, rhythmic thrumming vibrated up through the soles of the feet, signaling the start of the cycle. High above, the ventilation fans groaned, struggling to push stagnant air through the massive, lightless chamber. Every surface was slick with a thin layer of grime, the result of countless cycles of violence. A low-frequency hum began to build. Suddenly, the massive iron gates at the far end of the arena groaned. Metal shrieked against metal, an agonizing sound. The heavy bolts retracted with a series of thunderous mechanical thuds. Slowly, the gates began to pull apart, inch by agonizing inch. A draft of cold, stale air rushed out from the darkness beyond, carrying the scent of dust and dried blood. The gap widened. The gates hit their stops with a final, echoing clang. The entrance was clear. The arena was ready. The shadows beyond the gate did not just move, they exploded. First came the sound, a rhythmic, frantic tapping, that rapidly escalated into a roar of thousands of claws scraping against the industrial metal floor. It was a cacophony that erased all other noise, a rising tide of screeching and frantic movement. The first wave surged forward, a blurred mass of fur and teeth that spilled into the circular pit like water breaking a dam. They did not run, they collided. Bodies slammed into one another with sickening thuds, teeth snapping at the air, tails whipping in a desperate, tangled mess. The sheer density of the horde turned the arena into a living, breathing machine of violence. Every inch of the floor was claimed by the frantic scramble for space. The metallic floor groaned under the weight of the swarm, vibrating with every impact. Claws skittered across the surface, leaving deep, jagged gouges in the iron. The air grew thick with the smell of musk and the heat of thousands of bodies pressed together in a confined space. There was no order, only the relentless, driving pressure of the swarm. The center of the pit was a blind spot in the storm, while the outer edges of the arena churned with the frantic, clawing mass of the horde. The very heart of the circle remained untouched. The camera pushed past the wall of fur and snapping teeth, cutting through the thick, swirling dust that choked the air. It found the stillness. Standing perfectly level on the scarred metal floor was a single gray rat. He was a singular point of defiance in a sea of mindless aggression. A strip of red fabric clung to his shoulders, rippling in the stagnant, heated air of the arena. It was a sharp, vibrant slash of color against the dull, grime-streaked iron of the floor. Around him, combatants collided with bone-jarring force, their bodies slamming into the ground just inches from his feet. He did not shift his weight. He did not blink. He stood as a silent anchor, a static object in a world of kinetic chaos. The horde tore at one another, teeth locking and tails whipping in a desperate struggle for dominance, yet the space around him remained clear. He was the eye of the hurricane, a quiet presence that seemed to repel the violence without moving a muscle. The contrast was absolute. The camera moved closer, pushing past the frantic blur of the surrounding horde until the world beyond the gray rat ceased to exist. The focus narrowed to his face, stripping away the noise and the movement of the pit. His eyes were the only thing that mattered. They were wide, unblinking, and burned with a steady, intense orange light that seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own. There was no flicker of panic, no trace of the adrenaline that drove the rest of the arena to madness. Instead, there was a cold, surgical precision in that gaze. It was the look of something that had already calculated the outcome of the violence before it had even begun. The orange glow did not reflect the chaos. It pierced through it. Every movement of the horde, every snapping jaw and desperate claw was tracked by those eyes with an unnatural, analytical stillness. They held a depth that felt detached from the physical struggle, as if the rat were watching the brawl from a distance, measuring the patterns of the fight like a scholar reading a text. He did not look at the combatants. He looked through them, his focus locked on a reality that only he could perceive. In the center of the slaughter, those glowing eyes remained the only source of order. The arena erupted into a frenzy of blind instinct. The horde abandoned all strategy, turning their aggression inward as the pit transformed into a roiling mass of fur and snapping jaws. Bodies collided with audible thuds, sending ripples of impact through the metal floor that vibrated against the ground. Claws scraped against the iron, creating a high-pitched, discordant screech that filled the entire space. It was a chaotic, swirling vortex of violence. Yet, in the very center of this upheaval, the gray rat stood as a silent, immovable monument. He was an island of absolute peace in a sea of carnage. Combatants lunged past him, their momentum carrying them into one another with bone-crushing force, but not a single strike touched his space. He did not shift his stance or react to the proximity of the teeth that snapped inches from his face. The horde surged around him. He remained anchored, his posture unchanged, a singular point of stability amidst the collapse of order. The violence intensified. He simply waited, unmoved by the frantic, dying gasps of those who tore themselves apart just to reach him. The camera began to orbit the gray rat, a slow, deliberate circle that cut through the thick haze of the arena. With every degree of rotation, the perspective shifted, revealing the sheer scale of the madness. Fur flew in thick, matted clumps, and teeth snapped with a wet, rhythmic clicking. Combatants lunged through the air, their bodies blurring into streaks of gray and brown as they collided inches from his face. The force of their impact sent shockwaves through the floor, yet the rat did not flinch. He was a statue carved from silence. A claw raked the air a hair's breadth from his whiskers, the wind of the strike ruffling the fur on his neck. But he remained anchored. The camera pushed closer, capturing the frantic, wide-eyed terror of the attackers as they tumbled past him, their momentum carrying them into the teeth of their peers. He was the eye of the storm, a fixed point of stillness while the world around him disintegrated into a blur of motion. He did not blink, he did not lean, and he did not recoil. The camera circled again, confirming that even as the arena reached its peak of lethal intensity, he remained untouched, unbothered, and entirely unmoved. The gray rat finally shifted his focus. His glowing orange eyes narrowed, no longer just observing the brawl, but dissecting it. He tracked the trajectory of a lunging attacker, his gaze locking onto the exact point where the enemy would inevitably overextend. To the others, the arena was a storm of blind rage. To him, it was a series of predictable, failing vectors. He watched a pair of combatants collide, his eyes darting to the precise moment their balance failed. He mentally mapped the arc of every strike, noting the wasted energy in every frantic lunge. His mind moved faster than the violence itself, breaking down the chaotic patterns into a grid of cause and effect. He saw the hesitation in a claw swipe before the muscle even fired. He calculated the exact millisecond a defender would drop his guard. Every movement in the pit became a data point, a flaw in the design of the horde. He ignored the shrieks and the thuds, focusing entirely on the geometry of the conflict. He was reading the fight like a script, anticipating the collapse of each attacker long before they hit the ground. The orange light in his eyes pulsed in rhythm. The intensity of the brawl spiked, pushing the limits of the arena floor. Combatants slammed into the metal plating with such force that the surface began to groan. Beneath the frantic clawing, the iron floor started to grind, sending a shower of jagged sparks spraying into the air. These embers danced through the gloom, illuminating the desperate, snarling faces of the horde. Every impact sent a vibration through the structure, a rhythmic thrumming that rattled the very foundations of the pit. Yet, in the heart of this friction, the gray rat remained a pillar of absolute stability. Sparks showered down around him, sizzling as they touched the floor, but none dared to land on his fur. He stood as if shielded by an invisible barrier, the chaos swirling in a tight, violent orbit that refused to breach his personal space. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and heated metal. He did not shift his weight to avoid the debris. He did not blink as the sparks flew past his eyes. The floor beneath him buckled and warped from the sheer kinetic energy of the surrounding combat. Yet his footing remained perfectly level. He was the only thing in the arena that did not vibrate, did not panic, and did not burn. The stillness broke. The gray rat lifted a single paw, the movement so fluid it seemed to defy the frantic rhythm of the arena. He did not rush. He did not react to the snarling combatants lunging inches from his face. Instead, he stepped into the void left by a falling opponent. His placement was surgical, his weight shifting with a grace that ignored the surrounding carnage. He moved as if the chaotic brawl were a map, and he was simply following the path of least resistance. When two combatants collided in a blur of fur and teeth, he occupied the exact space they vacated a heartbeat later. He walked through the eye of the storm, his paws finding purchase on the slick metal floor where no other creature dared to tread. Every step was a calculated decision, a precise insertion into the gaps between lunging claws. He wove through the melee, his path a winding line. Each stride brought him deeper into the heart of the pit, his focus unwavering as he navigated the shifting geometry of the fight. The path forward narrowed as a massive combatant broke from the pack. This opponent was twice the size of the others, its muscles coiled with raw, unrefined power. It lunged, claws extended, aiming a strike that would have shattered stone. The gray rat did not accelerate. He did not retreat. He simply continued his stride, his eyes locked on the trajectory of the incoming blow. As the massive form closed the distance, the rat shifted his weight by a fraction of an inch. It was a movement so slight it was nearly imperceptible, a subtle adjustment of his center of gravity. The massive opponent crashed through the air where the rat had stood a millisecond before, its claws scraping against the metal floor with a screeching impact. The momentum carried the attacker forward, stumbling into the empty space the rat had just vacated. The gray rat did not look back. He did not acknowledge the near miss. He placed his next paw with the same calm precision as before, his rhythm entirely undisturbed by the violence that had just brushed his side. The massive rat spun, disoriented and off balance, while the gray rat continued his steady, fluid progression through the center of the pit. The metal floor beneath his paws began to vibrate. It was not the tremor of impact or the grinding of claws, but a low-frequency hum that resonated through his bones. He stopped. The chaos of the arena seemed to dim, the frantic shrieks of the combatants fading into a dull background drone. Beneath the surface of the arena, a network of light flared to life. Thin, glowing lines of energy pulsed through the metal, weaving a complex web across the floor that remained invisible to every other creature in the pit. These lines were not random. They were a roadmap of structural weakness and kinetic potential. He watched as a line flared bright blue, tracing a path through the densest cluster of fighting rats. He tilted his head, his eyes tracking the flow of the energy as it mapped out a sequence of safe zones. The floor was no longer a flat sheet of steel, but a grid of shifting possibilities. He reached out with a paw, testing the air above a glowing junction. The energy hummed, responding to his presence. He had found the hidden logic of the arena. He took a single, deliberate step, his paw landing exactly where the light intersected the metal. The energy surged upward, guiding his movement. He moved with a fluidity that defied the chaos of the pit. Every step was a deliberate placement, a calculated arc that bypassed the frantic lunges of the surrounding combatants. While the other rats threw their weight into wild, desperate strikes, he glided across the metal floor. He followed the glowing lines of energy, his paws landing in the precise intervals where no claw could reach. A combatant lunged, its body a blur of uncoordinated force, but the gray rat simply pivoted. He did not rush, he did not accelerate. He flowed around the attacker like water around a stone, his path dictated by the luminous geometry beneath his feet. The surrounding violence appeared clumsy, a stuttering, jagged mess of motion compared to his own seamless progression. He stepped over a fallen limb, adjusted his course by a hair's breadth, and continued forward. The energy lines pulsed beneath his touch, guiding him through the densest clusters of the brawl. He navigated the gaps between lunging bodies with an unnatural grace, his body language calm and measured. Every movement was efficient, stripped of all wasted effort. He ignored the frantic collisions happening inches from his path, his focus locked entirely on the next intersection of light. He was a silent, steady current moving through a storm, his presence barely registering as a disturbance to the combatants who were too lost in their own frantic, failing efforts to notice the precision of his passage. The rhythm of the arena began to break. The constant, heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor slowed, replaced by the ragged, uneven sound of labored breathing. Combatants who had been lunging with reckless intensity only moments before now dragged their limbs across the metal. One by one, the rats began to collapse, their muscles failing to sustain the frantic pace of the brawl. A large combatant lunged, its strike wild and off balance, and missed by a wide margin. It stumbled, unable to recover its footing, and fell hard against the floor. The impact echoed, signaling a shift in the tide. Panic rippled through the remaining horde. They lashed out with desperate, uncoordinated swipes, but every blow met only empty air. Frantic, high-pitched shrieks erupted from the corners of the pit, a cacophony of confusion and mounting dread. They scrambled to regain their footing, but their movements were heavy, sluggish, and devoid of purpose. The air grew thick with the sound of their gasping breaths and the scrape of claws against metal as they struggled to stand. They were failing, and the realization sparked a new wave of terror. They looked around, searching for a target, but their eyes were clouded with exhaustion. The once deafening roar of the fight dissolved into a series of jagged, desperate cries. The gray rat moved through the final, thinning ranks of the horde. He did not turn his head toward the shrieks. He did not acknowledge the frantic, clawing motions of the rats collapsing around him. His focus remained singular, a locked gaze directed at the epicenter of the pit. A combatant, driven by a last surge of adrenaline, lunged toward him. The gray rat did not increase his speed. He simply tilted his weight, letting the attacker pass through the space he had occupied a heartbeat before. The attacker hit the metal floor with a dull, heavy thud, sliding into the shadows. The gray rat continued his steady, rhythmic progression. He stepped over a tangled mess of limbs and broken breath, his paws finding purchase on the cold, vibrating metal. Each movement was a testament to his detachment. He was a machine of intent, filtering out the chaos of the dying brawl to isolate the path ahead. The shrieks grew louder, but they were merely background noise. He reached the center of the arena, where the vibrations were most intense. He stopped. The air around him felt charged, a static pressure. The final remnants of the horde collided with a desperate, jarring force. Every strike was a frantic attempt to break the stalemate, yet every blow failed to land. The sound of claws scraping against metal escalated, rising in pitch until it threatened to shatter the silence of the pit. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and exertion. It pressed against the walls of the arena, vibrating with a low, rhythmic thrum that pulsed through the floorboards. The remaining combatants, driven by a primal need to survive, lunged at one another with wild, uncoordinated movements. They slammed into the metal, their bodies sliding across the slick surface in a blur of motion. The cacophony reached a breaking point, a deafening roar of shrieks and impacts that filled every corner of the space. Then, the noise began to thin. It narrowed into a single, piercing frequency that cut through the chaos like a blade. The pressure in the arena spiked. It was a physical weight, a tightening of the atmosphere that forced the combatants to slow their frantic pace. They stumbled, their limbs trembling under the strain of the invisible force. The air felt brittle, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Every rat in the pit froze, caught in the grip of a sudden, suffocating stillness. The pressure reached a point of total saturation. Every atom in the arena seemed to vibrate, caught in the wake of the impending collapse. Then, the gray rat stopped. He did not slow down. He ceased all motion instantly, as if he had been struck by an invisible wall. His paws locked onto the metal surface, grounding him against the rising tide of energy. The effect was immediate. The air around him began to warp, bending the light and sound into jagged, distorted patterns. It was not a change in temperature, but a shift in the fabric of the space itself. The atmosphere rippled outward from his position, creating concentric waves that pulsed through the remaining combatants. They stood paralyzed, their muscles locked in a state of suspended animation, unable to complete their final, desperate lunges. The gray rat remained perfectly still, his focus absolute, his presence a singular point of stability. The floor beneath him groaned, the metal plates buckling under the weight of the distorted time. Sparks erupted from the seams, ready to snap. The stillness shattered. It did not break, it evaporated. The gray rat launched himself forward, but the motion was not a stride, it was a displacement. One moment he occupied the center of the pit, and the next, he was a streak of motion that defied the eye. His paws struck the metal floor with a rhythm too rapid to be heard, creating a low, humming vibration that rattled the very foundations of the arena. He moved in a series of sharp, jagged angles, cutting through the stagnant air like a needle through silk. His body became a smear of gray, a kinetic blur that left afterimages hanging in the distorted atmosphere. The surrounding combatants, still locked in their paralyzed state, were bypassed before their nerves could register his shift in position. He did not dodge. He simply ceased to be where the obstacles were. The air groaned as he tore through it, the pressure waves from his passage knocking loose debris into the air, where they hung suspended in the wake of his speed. He was a singular, focused force of momentum, operating on a plane of existence where time had lost its linear grip. Every muscle in his frame worked in perfect, mechanical harmony, driving him forward with a velocity that turned the surrounding chaos into a static backdrop. He was no longer a participant in the fight. He was the architect of its conclusion, moving with a grace that rendered the laws of motion irrelevant. 12 lunges converged on the center of the pit simultaneously. From every compass point, claws and teeth drove toward the space the gray rat had occupied a heartbeat before. The air whistled as the strike paths intersected, a lethal web of force closing in on a single coordinate. But the coordinate was empty. The gray rat had already vacated the space, his movement so precise it left the vacuum of his absence to be filled by the attackers themselves. The collision was inevitable. 12 bodies slammed into each other with the force of a falling wall, teeth snapping against fur and bone as their own momentum betrayed them. The sound of the impact was a wet, heavy thud that echoed off the arena walls. He was already 3 feet away, his paws landing softly on the metal floor, his posture undisturbed. He watched the pile of tangled limbs and thrashing forms with cold, analytical focus. They had aimed for a target that no longer existed. Their own aggression turned into a weapon against them. He stood in the quiet periphery, his presence barely registering as a ripple in the settling dust. The arena floor vibrated beneath him, the metal plates groaning under the weight. He did not look back at the chaos. He simply adjusted his stance, his eyes scanning the next sequence of the fight, ready to dismantle the remaining resistance. The air began to fracture. It did not merely ripple, it splintered into jagged shards of light and shadow. The gray rat stepped forward, and for a heartbeat, he was not one, but three. 3 distinct versions of his form occupied the space, each caught in a different phase of the same movement. He was a ghost in the machine of the arena, flickering between seconds with a frequency that made the eyes ache. The distortion intensified, dragging the surrounding reality into his wake. The metal floor beneath him warped, the rivets popping. He was everywhere at once, a phantom presence that defied the singular nature of existence. The remaining combatants swiped at the air, hitting nothing but the afterimages he left behind. He reached out, his claw tracing a line through the air, and the space behind his finger tore open. The remaining combatants were desperate now, their vision clouded by the phantom images of the gray rat. He stopped his flickering movement, standing perfectly still as the horde surged toward him in a blind, uncoordinated wave. He waited until the very last millisecond, then sidestepped with a subtle, fluid shift of his weight. The vacuum left in his wake acted like a magnet for their aggression. They could not stop, they could not turn. They collided with each other at full speed, a chaotic mass of fur and teeth slamming together with the force of a landslide. The sound was sickening, a sharp, bone-crushing crack that resonated through the metal floor of the pit. One by one, they piled up, limbs tangling, as they tumbled over the debris of their own failed strikes. He watched from the edge of the impact zone, his eyes glowing with a steady, cold light. He did not need to strike a single blow. He simply stood as the architect of their ruin, observing the way their own momentum folded them into the dust. The arena floor shook under the weight of the fallen, the metal groaning as the last of the attackers collapsed into a heap of twitching bodies. The frenzy had reached its violent end. The few combatants still standing were twitching, their eyes wide with the realization of their isolation. They lunged, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim the space the gray rat occupied. He did not retreat. He pivoted, his body a blur of calculated efficiency that forced the attackers to overextend. As the first rat lunged, the gray rat shifted his center of gravity by a mere hair's breadth, causing the attacker to veer off balance. He nudged the air with a flick of his claw, creating a localized pressure wave that acted as a guide. The attacker stumbled, his momentum carrying him directly into the path of a second combatant closing in from the flank. They slammed together, a tangled mess of fur and claws. The gray rat moved again, a silent shadow dancing between the chaos. He positioned himself behind a third attacker, waiting for the precise moment of impact. As the third rat charged, the gray rat stepped aside, leaving the attacker to collide head-on with the wreckage of the previous pair. The force of the impact was absolute. He watched the tangle of limbs, his glowing eyes tracking the vector of every strike, ensuring no blow was wasted. He was the fulcrum upon which their violence turned. The final few combatants stood frozen, their lungs burning, eyes darting in search of a target that refused to stay still. The gray rat began his final sequence. He did not run, he vanished. His form became a streak of gray light, flickering across the arena floor with such velocity that his silhouette seemed to fracture into a dozen copies. He danced through the gaps between the remaining rats, his paws barely touching the metal. Each movement was a calculated strike against their perception. He appeared to their left, then their right, then directly behind them, all within the span of a single heartbeat. The attackers swung wildly, their claws slicing through nothing but the stagnant air. They spun in circles, chasing the afterimages of his movement, their coordination shattering into pure panic. He wove a web of motion so complex that their eyes could not track his path. They collided with one another, stumbling over their own feet as they tried to pivot toward a ghost. He was everywhere and nowhere. The last remaining combatant stumbled, his legs giving way as his own momentum betrayed him. He hit the metal floor with a heavy, hollow thud that echoed briefly against the arena walls. Then, the sound died. The deafening cacophony of scraping claws, frantic shrieks, and grinding metal vanished in a single, sharp instant. It was not a gradual fade, but a total, abrupt cessation of all movement. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against the eardrums like a physical weight. It rang with a high-pitched, thin frequency that seemed to vibrate in the stagnant air. Every rat that had been tearing at the floor lay motionless, their chests heaving in shallow, ragged breaths that made no sound. The arena, once a swirling vortex of dust and shadows, settled into a state of unnatural stillness. The dust began to drift downward, coating the debris in a fine gray layer. Not a single claw scraped, not a single tooth clicked. The only thing remaining was the absolute jarring void where the violence had been just seconds before. The silence was so profound that the faint, rhythmic ticking of cooling metal pipes became the only audible event in the vast, circular pit. The combatants remained where they had fallen, defeated by their own lack of control, leaving the gray rat as the sole entity standing amidst the wreckage of the brawl. The gray rat stood motionless in the exact center of the arena floor. He did not shift his weight. He did not blink. Around him, the debris of the brawl lay scattered in chaotic patterns, torn fur, broken metal shards, and deep gouges in the floor plating. He remained the only vertical point in the entire pit. The red fabric draped across his back now hung limp. It settled slowly, the fabric fibers coming to rest against his fur as the residual air currents in the arena finally died down. He held his position with absolute rigidity, his paws planted firmly on the cold, scarred metal. The dust that had been kicked up by the hundreds of combatants began to drift toward the floor, coating the surrounding defeated horde in a thin, pale veil. He stood amidst this gray snowfall, his posture unchanged, his breathing shallow and controlled. Not a single muscle twitched. The silence of the arena was absolute, broken only by the faint, metallic ping of cooling pipes. He remained fixed. The gray rat tilted his head, a slow, deliberate movement that cut through the stillness. His eyes, glowing with a steady, intense orange light, swept across the arena floor. He tracked the positions of the defeated combatants, his gaze lingering on the tangled limbs and discarded metal shards. He did not look at them with triumph or malice, but with the cold, clinical focus of a surveyor measuring a site. His pupils contracted and expanded, adjusting to the dim, dusty light as he mapped the aftermath of the brawl. He turned his head to the left, scanning the perimeter where the bodies were stacked deepest. He paused for a heartbeat, his whiskers twitching as he caught the scent of ozone and cooling metal rising from the debris. He stood as the sole witness to the carnage, until he had fully cataloged the extent of the silence he had created. The survey was complete. The gray rat shifted his weight, his back paws digging into the metal floor to provide leverage. He pivoted, his body rotating with a smooth, mechanical efficiency that ignored the scattered bodies of his former opponents. He did not glance back at the carnage. His focus had shifted entirely away from the center of the pit. He took a single, measured step, his claws clicking against the cold, scarred metal. The movement was fluid, lacking any hesitation. He continued the rotation until he was facing the far end of the arena, his posture squared toward the darkness. He ignored the pile of defeated combatants to his left and the jagged gouges in the floor to his right. His orange eyes remained fixed on the distant, shadowed wall. He adjusted his stance, planting his feet firmly to align his body with the new path. The red fabric on his back shifted with the motion. He took another step, then another, his movements purposeful and devoid of any lingering connection to the violence he had just concluded. The far wall of the arena remained a solid, impenetrable curtain of shadow until the air itself began to vibrate. A low, rhythmic hum resonated through the metal floor, vibrating against his paws. Without warning, the darkness ahead fractured. A blinding vertical beam of pure white light pierced the gloom, carving a clean, sharp path through the stagnant dust of the pit. The light was intense, reflecting off the scattered metal shards and turning the swirling particles in the air into a shimmering golden haze. The gray rat did not recoil. He stood his ground as the radiance expanded, its edges crisp and unyielding against the surrounding blackness. The beam hit the floor with enough force to kick up a fine spray of metallic dust, creating a glowing threshold that separated the ruined arena from the unknown space beyond. He squinted, his orange eyes narrowing to slits as they adjusted to the sudden, overwhelming brightness. The light illuminated the path ahead. He took a half step forward, his claws finding purchase on the edge of the illuminated zone. He remained motionless at the edge of the brilliance. He stepped forward. The transition was immediate. The cold, metallic tang of the arena floor vanished, replaced by a warmth that pressed against his fur. The red fabric on his back caught the light, glowing with a sudden, vivid intensity as he moved deeper into the beam. He paused at the very center of the radiance, his paws planted firmly on the threshold. He turned his head, his orange eyes scanning the arena one last time. The pit was a graveyard of silent, motionless forms. Not a single limb twitched, not a single breath disturbed the heavy, dust-filled air. The silence was absolute, a heavy weight that had finally settled over the ruins. He looked back toward the light, his posture rigid and his movements devoid of any hesitation. He resumed his walk, each step carrying him further from the debris and into the heart of the white glow. The light began to swallow his silhouette, blurring the edges of his form until he was nothing more than a flicker of motion against the brilliance. He did not look back again. He moved with a steady, rhythmic pace, his claws clicking against the floor until the sound was muffled by the sheer density of the radiance. He walked until the light filled his entire field of vision, leaving the silent, ruined arena behind forever, stepping into the unknown expanse.